children need me!
Have you ever wondered just how far human cruelty can go in the name of control and justice? The British Empire, often hailed for its global dominance, masked a brutal side that's rarely discussed. Prisoners marched to their deaths through snake-infested jungles, backs flayed open under the lash, and bodies stretched to breaking point on brutal torture racks. What was the true price of defiance under this iron-fisted rule? And how did these punishments shape history? Join us on this special episode as we uncover the 15 most disgusting punishment methods used in the British Empire. Kicking off our series is a punishment method that will leave you amazed. Number 15. Boiling in oil. One of the most horrific punishments in the history of the British Empire was death by boiling in oil. This cruel method of execution was used for the worst criminals and showed just how capable humans can be of calculated cruelty. Imagine a huge pot of oil, heated until it's bubbling and smoking, with a crowd gathered around to watch. The condemned person, usually naked, would be slowly lowered into the hot liquid. Their screams would fill the air as their flesh is literally cooked off their bones. The brutality of this method was meant to scare others from committing similar crimes. Depending on how hot the oil was and how skilled the executioner was, death could take anywhere from 15 minutes to several hours. The victim's skin would blister and peel. Their internal organs would slowly cook, and they would often be aware of what was happening until the very end. This disgusting punishment was mainly reserved for high treason against the crown, acts of poisoning, maritime piracy, and extreme cases of heresy. In 1531, Richard Roos became one of the most well-known victims of this punishment. He was a cook, accused of poisoning porridge at the Bishop of Rochester's household, and King Henry VIII specifically ordered his execution by boiling. This gruesome death served as a public warning against the crime of poisoning. But it wasn't just Britain that used this method. Other parts of the world had similar forms of boiling punishment too. In East Asia and continental Europe, water or lead replaced oil as the boiling medium, although oil was preferred because it could reach higher temperatures and cause more suffering. The effects of such executions went beyond just the condemned individuals. Public spectacles of boiling were powerful tools for controlling society, leaving lasting memories in communities. Witnesses often reported having nightmares and experiencing trauma from witnessing these events. This horrific practice continued until 1547, when England officially abolished boiling as a legal form of execution through the Statute of 1547. While this law marked a small step towards more humane punishment methods, many other brutal practices would continue for centuries. As chilling as the bubbling oil was, the British Empire had another punishment that combined spectacle with suffering. Number 14. Execution by hanging. What happens when death becomes a public spectacle? The twisted history of hangings will shock you. This method became the British Empire's preferred method of execution, symbolizing imperial justice from London to its far-flung colonies. Public executions turned into gruesome shows, attracting thousands of spectators. At Tyburn Tree in London, people from all walks of life gathered to witness what they referred to as the hanging match. Vendors capitalized on the dreadful event by selling merchandise, snacks, and even death programs detailing the condemned's crimes. The mechanics behind judicial hanging were brutally precise. A carefully calculated drop determined the prisoner's fate. However, the science of hanging was not foolproof. Records from the 1800s reveal numerous awkward executions. William Calcraft, Britain's most notorious hangman, who hung over 450 victims during his 45-years-long career, gained infamy for his short drops that left victims writhing in agony. In one particularly horrific case, James Pratt dangled for 3 excruciating minutes before death claimed him. The role of executioner carried its own dark prestige. James Berry, who served as a hangman from 1884 to 1892, wrote extensively about his experiences. The condemned would often shake my hand before I placed the noose. It was a peculiar intimacy, being the last human contact they would ever know. The psychological impact on witnesses, prison staff, and executioners proved profound. Multiple hangmen reported recurring nightmares, alcoholism, and deep moral conflicts. George Throttler Smith, who executed over 200 people, eventually resigned, stating his inability to reconcile the taking of life with any notion of justice. While hangmen perfected the art of calculated death, another method relied on nature's most hated creatures to instill unimaginable dread. Number 13. Rat torture. They say the fear of rats is universal, but during the British Empire, this fear was weaponized in ways you won't believe. This gruesome technique, employed during the 17th and 18th centuries, exploited one of humanity's deepest fears, being eaten alive by rats. The execution of this method was meticulously cruel. Guards would confine large, starved rats in a metal container or hollow vessel and secure it against the victim's bare abdomen or chest. The opposite end of the container would be gradually heated, forcing the frightened rats to escape through the only available route, the prisoner's flesh. To escape, the rats will often scratch through the victim's flesh. The psychological torment began long before the physical agony set in. Prisoners would hear the frantic scratching of claws against metal, feel the desperate movement of the trapped rodents, and experience growing terror as the container became hotter. As the rats' desperation peaked, they would start gnawing through the victim's body, resulting in a slow, agonizing death. This barbaric punishment served multiple purposes within the British penal system, ranging from interrogation to punishment and deterrence. The threat of rat torture often broke even the most steadfast prisoners. The practice was especially prevalent in colonial territories where oversight was minimal, and local authorities exercised considerable discretion in punishment methods. In the Caribbean colonies, rat torture became a dreaded tool for suppressing slave rebellions and maintaining control through fear. While rat torture played on primal fears, the British Empire had another method that tore human bodies apart, one lash at a time. Number 12. The bloody spectacle of flogging. How did the British Empire use the lash to control entire crews and crush rebellion? The cat-o'-nine-tails was as infamous as it was cruel. Flogging was one of the British Empire's most brutal forms of punishment, a method that turned human flesh into strips of torn skin and exposed muscle. The cat-o'-nine-tails earned its fearsome reputation through its devastating design: 9 knotted leather thongs attached to a wooden handle. Each strike multiplied the pain ninefold, with the knots tearing into the victim's back, creating deep lacerations that often became infected in the unsanitary conditions of ships and prisons. Military commanders justified this brutality as necessary for maintaining strict discipline. A standard flogging session consisted of 39 lashes for minor infractions, 100 for serious offenses, and up to 100 more for desertion or mutiny. The ritual itself was carefully choreographed to maximize both physical agony and psychological terror. The victim was stripped to the waist and tied to a wooden frame or ship's rigging. A ship's surgeon stood by to determine if the condemned could survive additional strikes. Death by flogging was not uncommon. British naval regulations required the entire crew to witness these punishments. The sight of their shipmates flayed back and the sound of his agonized cries served as a powerful deterrent against disobedience. The psychological impact of witnessing such brutality often proved as damaging as receiving the lashes. In addition to the cat-o'-nine tails, other flogging tools meant using birch rods, cane, and whip. The aftermath of severe flogging left victims permanently disfigured. Scarred backs became a mark of shame, a physical reminder of past transgressions. Many survivors suffered chronic pain and limited mobility for the rest of their lives. But when the lashes stopped, another nightmare awaited those who dared to defy the empire, a one-way ticket to an unforgiving land far from home. Number 11. Journey to penal colonies. Exiled thousands of miles from home, convicts faced unspeakable horrors. Death often seemed like mercy. The British Empire's penal colonies are proof of one of history's most ruthless punishment systems. Between 1788 and 1868, Britain transported approximately 16,200 convicts to Australia alone, transforming the continent into a vast prison for those deemed unworthy of remaining in British society. The journey to these distant shores was a punishment in itself. Convict ships, nicknamed floating hells, crammed hundreds of prisoners into dark, rat-infested holds. Disease spread rapidly through these confined spaces, with dysentery, typhus, and scurvy claiming countless lives. Ships' logs reveal horrifying mortality rates. Some vessels lost up to 9% of their human cargo before reaching their destination. The First Fleet of 1788 exemplifies the brutal nature of this punishment system. 11 ships carried 759 convicts on an 8-month voyage to establish New South Wales. The prisoners, chained below deck in spaces barely tall enough to sit upright, endured rancid food, contaminated water, and the constant threat of abuse from guards. Life in the penal colonies proved equally harsh. Convicts faced backbreaking labor from dawn to dusk. Prisoners quarried stone, cleared land, and constructed buildings under the scorching sun. Also, many convicts never saw their families again, as they were condemned to live thousands of miles from home. However, minor infractions resulted in flogging, while serious offenses led to execution. The Norfolk Island penal settlement earned particular notoriety for its cruelty. Convicts there reportedly begged for death rather than endure their circumstances. One prisoner's account describes their daily existence. "We slept in chains, ate in chains, worked in chains. The sound of metal scraping stone became the melody of our existence." Jamaica's Port Royal and other Caribbean penal colonies subjected convicts to additional horrors. Tropical diseases, hostile environments, and brutal labor regimes in sugar plantations created conditions that few survived. These settlements served dual purposes, removing undesirables from British society while providing free labor to expand the empire's economic interests. As if exile wasn't enough, the next method became the empire's way of ensuring the victim's shame was visible for a lifetime. Number 10. Branding of criminals. A single touch of a burning metal tool was enough to leave a criminal marked for life, both physically and socially. Branding criminals with hot irons was a brutal form of punishment used in the British Empire. It went beyond physical pain and became a lasting symbol of shame for those condemned. The process involved heating metal tools until they were red hot and then pressing them onto the exposed skin of the victim, usually on visible areas like the face, hands, or forehead. Each brand had a specific meaning. T marked thieves, F designated fugitives, M identified murderers, R branded rioters, and V marked vagrants. The agony inflicted by this method was unbearable. When the heated metal touched their flesh, it destroyed nerve endings and caused severe burns that would leave permanent scars. Many victims would faint from the pain, while others would struggle violently against their restraints, resulting in additional injuries. The psychological impact of branding was just as devastating as the physical pain. Those who were branded became living reminders of their crimes, unable to escape their past. They face difficulties finding jobs and are often rejected by their families. As a result, many branded criminals retreated to the outskirts of society and formed isolated groups of outcasts. Branding served several purposes within the British criminal justice system, including identifying repeat offenders permanently, humiliating individuals publicly, and deterring others from committing crimes. The brutality of branding extended beyond the initial punishment itself. Infections were common after such procedures, leading many victims to suffer from fever and sepsis in the days following their branding. Even those who survived carried not only physical scars, but also deep emotional wounds that never truly healed. If branding etched pain onto flesh, the next punishment subjected offenders to the relentless wrath of their neighbors. Number 9. Pillories and stocks. Imagine being in a busy town square during the British Empire, where a wooden device stands as a harsh reminder of public punishment. The pillory, a medieval invention that lasted until the 19th century, held its victims in place, with their heads and hands trapped between two wooden boards. These tools of shame came in different shapes and sizes. The pillory suspended its victims standing, and stocks restrained people at ground level, locking their ankles between wooden blocks. Both served the same purpose, which is to display wrongdoers as public spectacles. A sentence in the pillory or stocks could last anywhere from a few hours to 3 days. The physical suffering began right away as victims fought to stay in their uncomfortable positions. Yet physical pain was nothing compared to the mental torture that awaited. The true horror lay in the crowd's involvement. Local citizens saw these punishments as entertainment, gathering to mock and attack the helpless offenders. They threw rotten eggs and vegetables, sometimes dead animals and excrement. A few others will throw stones and mud, others will throw wastewater from kitchen and livestock farms. Many victims suffered serious injuries from these projectiles, especially to their exposed faces and heads. Some never healed from the trauma, both physical and psychological. Deaths were sporadic, except during long periods of exposure to harsh weather or especially violent crowds. The crimes that resulted in someone being put in the pillory varied from fraud and forgery, public drunkenness, blasphemy, adultery, and petty theft. A particularly dark aspect of pillory punishment was its use against marginalized groups. Religious minorities, political dissidents, and those accused of moral crimes were disproportionately subjected to this form of public humiliation. From the relentless crowd to the suffocating holds of floating prisons, the British Empire knew no limits to its punishments. Number 8. Imprisonment in hulks. Life on a prison hulk wasn't just a punishment. It was a slow death sentence, delivered under the guise of justice. Imagine a decommissioned warship, stripped of its naval glory, transformed into a floating nightmare. These vessels, known as prison hulks, represented one of the British Empire's most notorious punishment methods during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The practice began in 1776 when Britain lost its American colonies, previously a prime destination for transported convicts. Facing overcrowded prisons, authorities turned to these floating dungeons as a temporary solution that lasted nearly a century. Life aboard these maritime prisons defied human dignity. Prisoners were chained in pairs, crammed into dark, damp holds where fresh air barely penetrated. The wooden structures, rotting from years at sea, harbored deadly diseases like typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis, and dysentery. The Thames River hosted the majority of these floating prisons, with notorious hulks like the HMS Warrior and HMS Bellerophon becoming symbols of despair. Crimes warranting hulk imprisonment ranged from petty theft to serious offences, though many inmates awaited transportation to Australian penal colonies. The mortality rate aboard hulks reached shocking levels. Approximately 1 in 4 prisoners perished within their first year. Disease claimed most victims, while others succumbed to malnutrition, exposure, or brutal treatment from guards. Records from the HMS Justicia revealed that in 1778 alone, 176 of 632 prisoners died within months. The awful conditions led prison reformer John Howard to declare hulks worse than any other form of incarceration in Britain. The hulks were horrifying, but they pale in comparison to the unspeakable torment of the next punishment, which delivered unimaginable brutality in the name of justice. Number 7. Drawing and quartering. The mere whisper of drawing and quartering struck terror into the hearts of British subjects. This outlandish form of execution, reserved exclusively for men convicted of high treason, represented the pinnacle of state-sanctioned brutality in medieval and early modern Britain. The execution protocol involves the victim being hung until near death, followed by immediate cutting down while still conscious, and then disembowelment with the victim fully aware. The victim is further beheaded with the body sliced into 4 parts and displayed in a prominent public location. The infamous execution of William Wallace in 1305 stands as haunting evidence of this punishment's barbarity. His dismembered remains were displayed across Scotland and England as a warning against rebellion. Guy Fawkes narrowly escaped this fate by jumping from the scaffold, breaking his neck before the executioner could begin the gruesome procedure. During the 17th century, numerous Catholic priests met their end through this method, including Oliver Plunkett, whose head remains preserved at St. Peter's Church in Drogheda. The last recorded drawing and quartering took place in 1782, when David Tyree faced execution for high treason at Portsmouth. The psychological impact of this punishment extended far beyond its victims. Public displays of quartered bodies served as powerful reminders of state authority. British law maintained drawing and quartering as a legal punishment until 1870, when the Forfeiture Act officially abolished it. The end of drawing and quartering didn't mean the end of brutality. The next method turned the human body itself into an instrument of agony. Number 6. Strappado torture. The British Empire's arsenal of torture methods included the bone-shattering technique known as Strappado, a punishment so severe it turned human agony into a weapon of control. This medieval torture device transformed the human body's weight into an instrument of excruciating pain. Victims endured the horrific ordeal of having their hands bound behind their backs with thick rope. The executioner would then hoist them high into the air using a pulley system, leaving them suspended by their arms in an unnatural position. The intense pressure on the shoulder joints often resulted in immediate dislocation, accompanied by unbearable agony that echoed through prison chambers. The true brutality of Strappado lay in its variations. Some victims experienced the squared Strappado, where weights were attached to their feet, dramatically increasing the strain on their joints and muscles. Others faced the jerking Strappado, during which torturers would suddenly drop them several feet before abruptly stopping the fall, causing violent trauma to their entire body. British authorities primarily employed this method to extract confessions from suspected criminals and political dissidents. The combination of intense physical pain and the psychological terror of being suspended helplessly proved effective in breaking even the strongest wills. Many victims would confess to crimes they hadn't committed just to escape the torment. The torture chambers where Strappado took place were deliberately designed to amplify psychological distress. Victims would witness others suffering while awaiting their turn, listening to the haunting sounds of dislocating joints and agonized screams. This anticipatory terror often proved as effective as the physical torture itself in breaking prisoners' resolve. British colonial authorities particularly favored Strappado for its ability to inflict maximum pain while leaving minimal external evidence. Unlike flogging or branding, which left visible scars, Strappado's damage remained largely internal. Now, to the subscriber's pick. Subscriber's pick: chained, stretched, and stripped of dignity. This image speaks volumes about the agony of colonial punishment. Could this be the depiction of a prisoner subjected to torture by rack, where captives endured unspeakable pain as their limbs were stretched to the breaking point? The British Empire was infamous for its horrifying methods of control and subjugation, ensuring compliance through fear and brutality. What do you think drove people to create such horrifying punishment methods? Was it purely about control, or did it reveal something deeper about the human capacity for cruelty? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. The British Empire's methods of control were not limited to physical pain. Some forms of punishment leave no scars, but shatter the mind. Number 5. White torture. Hidden beneath the more visible brutalities of the British Empire lay a troubling form of punishment that left no physical scars, yet shattered minds beyond repair. White torture, also known as sensory deprivation torture, represented psychological warfare at its most refined and cruel. Picture a stark white room, devoid of any color or texture. The walls, ceiling, and floor all bleached to a clinical white. Prisoners found themselves stripped of their colored clothing and forced to wear white garments while eating colorless food served on white plates. The continuous bright lights never dimmed, destroying their sense of time and natural rhythms. The psychological devastation proved swift and profound. Without sensory input, the human mind begins to deteriorate within hours. Prisoners reported intense hallucinations, complete loss of identity, severe anxiety and panic attacks, cognitive dysfunction, and memory loss. British authorities perfected this technique through careful manipulation of the environment. The cells were soundproofed, eliminating all external noise except the prisoner's own thoughts. Guards wore soft-soled shoes and communicated through hand signals, creating silence that amplified the psychological pressure. The true horror of white torture lay in its invisible nature. Unlike physical torture that left evidence, This method allowed authorities to claim humane treatment while systematically destroying their victims' sanity. Many survivors emerged unable to function in normal society, their minds permanently altered by the experience. British colonial prisons incorporated elements of white torture into their standard practices. The infamous quiet cells in Singapore's Changi prison subjected political dissidents to extended periods of sensory deprivation. Similar facilities existed throughout the empire, from India to Africa. Medical records from the era reveal the calculated nature of this punishment. Prison doctors monitored inmates, documenting the progression of their psychological breakdown. These clinical observations helped refine the technique, determining the optimal conditions to break resistance without leaving physical evidence. While white torture broke minds with silence and deprivation, the next method went a step further, targeting both the mind and body in a horrifying tandem. Number 4. Starvation and solitary confinement. Imagine surviving on crumbs while locked in total darkness. This was life inside Britain's most feared prisons. Deep within the stone walls of British prisons, a troubling duo of punishment methods worked in haunting synchronicity: starvation and solitary confinement. The infamous Dartmoor prison earned its reputation as the prison of fear through its systematic use of these brutal tactics. Prison guards wielded food as a weapon, reducing rations to mere crumbs for inmates who defied authority. A typical punishment diet consisted of 1 pound of bread per day with nothing but water. The psychological torment of hunger intensified in the crushing isolation of solitary cells. Pentonville Prison pioneered the separate system. Tiny 13 by 7 foot cells where prisoners spent 23 hours daily in complete isolation. The combination of starvation and solitude drove many to madness. The workhouses implemented similar tactics, using food deprivation to punish those who failed to meet work quotas. Children as young as 6 faced reduced rations for minor infractions, their growing bodies permanently stunted by malnutrition. Dartmoor's infamous punishment block combined these methods to devastating effect. Prisoners endured weeks in pitch-black cells with barely enough sustenance to survive. Many emerged as shells of their former selves, their spirits crushed by the dual assault on body and mind. The psychological scars often proved permanent. Released prisoners reported recurring nightmares of starvation and isolation decades later. Medical records from the era document cases of severe post-traumatic stress, depression, and anxiety among former inmates of these institutions. As if starvation and isolation weren't cruel enough, the British Empire devised even more harrowing tools to break the human body and spirit. Number 3. The brutal use of iron collars and chains. The searing heat of chains and the sharp edges of iron collars were tools of oppression that left scars far deeper than skin. The British Empire's use of iron collars and chains is a reminder of colonial cruelty. These tools were more than just devices for keeping people captive. They were part of a deliberate system of torture, both physical and mental, intended to crush the human spirit. Iron collars, made from rough metal, were tightly fitted around the necks of victims. These barbaric devices had sharp edges on the inside that dug into the skin with every movement. Historical accounts from Jamaica reveal that these collars could weigh as much as 5 pounds, causing immense strain on the neck and damage to the spine. Chains were also used alongside these collars, linking prisoners together in groups of 6 to 8. This forced closeness created filthy conditions, as prisoners couldn't separate even for basic bodily functions. Records from Caribbean plantations show how chained groups worked in sugarcane fields under intense heat, with their shackles burning their skin and hindering their movements. The psychological aspect of this torture was equally devastating. Colonial rulers purposely designed these restraints to strip away human dignity. Prisoners were unable to sleep properly, found it hard to eat, and faced constant humiliation. British colonial documents from India reveal that iron collars were deliberately put on during public ceremonies, turning punishment into a spectacle. Records from the British East India Company show that these devices were used systematically in forced labor camps. Prisoners wearing combinations of collars and chains worked 16-hour shifts in mines, with reports indicating a 25% death rate among the restrained workers. Those who managed to survive often ended up with permanent physical deformities and deep psychological scars. From the weight of iron chains to the endless miles of death marches, the suffering only deepened under colonial rule. Number 2. Exile and death marches. One of the cruelest punishment methods used during British colonial rule was exile and death marches. This method stripped individuals of everything they held dear: their homes, families, and often their lives. It served as a reminder of the empire's ruthless approach to punishment and control. The infamous Andaman Islands penal settlement became a haunting symbol of this brutal practice. Located in the Bay of Bengal, this remote archipelago turned into a living nightmare for those banished to its shores. The journey itself claimed countless lives, with prisoners crammed into ships like cargo, battling disease, dehydration, and malnutrition. British authorities used geographical isolation as a weapon by sending political dissidents, rebels, and convicted criminals to these far-off places. The Andaman Cellular Jail, known as Kala Pani or Black Waters, housed thousands of Indian freedom fighters. Inside its walls, prisoners faced forced labor under the scorching tropical sun, with severe physical abuse from guards. Death marches represented another equally troubling aspect of exile punishment. Prisoners were forced to walk hundreds of miles through dangerous terrain, often in chains. Guards showed little mercy to those who stumbled, as exhausted prisoners faced beatings or executions. The mortality rates during these forced relocations reached staggering heights. Historical records from the Burma-Thailand Death March revealed that 20% of prisoners died along the way. Survivors carried deep physical and psychological scars, their spirits broken by the intentional cruelty of their captors. British colonial administrators used exile strategically to crush resistance movements. By removing influential figures from their communities, they hoped to suppress uprisings and dissent. The Andaman Islands became particularly notorious for housing political prisoners from India's independence movement, including prominent leaders who endured decades of isolation. The psychological impact of exile extended far beyond the individual prisoner. Entire communities lived in fear of being banished, knowing that opposing colonial rule might lead to permanent separation from their homeland. This created an atmosphere of terror that helped maintain British control over its vast empire through fear rather than loyalty. Number 1. The practice of whipping posts. Where exiles were forgotten, whipping posts ensured no one could escape the lash of British control. The whipping post is evidence of the British Empire's most heinous methods of punishment. These wooden or metal posts, deeply embedded in colonial soil from Jamaica to India, became symbols of terror and instruments of absolute control over enslaved and colonized populations. Colonial records paint a horrifying picture of systematic brutality at these posts. In Jamaica, enslaved individuals received up to 20 lashes for minor infractions like taking extra food rations. The posts, positioned prominently in town squares or plantation yards, turned punishment into public spectacles designed to break both body and spirit. The practice spread across the Indian subcontinent, where British authorities adopted the whipping post to maintain control over indentured laborers. In Bengal, tea plantation workers faced regular floggings for failing to meet impossible quotas. One British officer's diary entry from 1857 describes, "The natives must learn their place through the sting of the lash." Today witnessed 30 strokes administered to a young laborer. The post ran red, yet order must be maintained. The racial hierarchy enforced through these posts was deliberate and systematic. White colonists rarely faced public whipping, while enslaved and indigenous people could be bound to the post for infractions as minor as looking directly at a European, speaking their native language, or gathering in groups of more than 3. The practice continued well into the 19th century, with some colonies recording over 1,000 whippings annually. These posts, many of which still stand in former colonies, remain powerful symbols of the British Empire's legacy of institutionalized cruelty and systematic dehumanization of colonized peoples. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.